All right, turn, if you will, to a story found in Matthew, the 14th chapter of Matthew. I'll be reading from verse 13 to 21. This is the story or description of the events around one of the miraculous feedings of Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000, with just a few loaves of bread and some fish. There in verse 13, it says when Jesus heard about it, and that little backstory on that heard about it, it's heard about the brutal execution or murder of John in prison. This was right after Jesus had heard about that, according to Matthew. So that's where we pick up in verse 13. Matthew writes, "When Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. When the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd had compassion on them and healed their sick. When evening came, the disciples approached him and said, 'This place is deserted and it's already late. Send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' 'They don't need to go away,' Jesus told them. 'You give them something to eat.' 'But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish here,' they said to him. 'Bring them here to me,' he said. Then he commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed them. He broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up 12 baskets full of leftover pieces. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." So, by way of backstory on this, as I said, this was right after Jesus, according to Matthew anyways, this is right after Jesus had heard about the death of his friend John, or his cousin John. Now, we don't really know how close they may have been. When you consider who Jesus is and his love for everybody, it had to have affected him. I mean, think about it. Here's John, who had been the one announcing the coming of Christ. John, who the crowds thought of as a prophet. Jesus recognized that he was a prophet. Jesus himself said no greater man has ever been there before John. There was no greater prophet than John. So Jesus had a close relationship, or at least a close love of John. And when he found out about his death and the way he died, Jesus apparently wanted to get alone, get away for a few hours of much needed contemplation and prayer and rest. So he had the disciples get in the boat and cross the lake, but the crowds heard about it, and they weren't going to let him get away that easy. They swarmed around the lake on foot and met him on the other side. And Jesus, being Jesus, took pity on them, or had compassion for them. He understood that they had needs, and he wanted to help them. But this passage is more than just a testament about Jesus' compassion. He said he had compassion for the crowd, but it's more than just a testament about his compassion and his power. It's a testament that teaches us a profound lesson about our own limitations and the extraordinary things that God can do when we offer what little we have in faith. We might think we have no real talent, that we don't have a lot of abilities. But if we offer them to God, what we do have, He can use them. In this story, you have a little boy who offered up, when you look at the same story over in John, a little boy offered up 5 little loaves of bread and some fish, a couple fish. And these weren't what we think of as a loaf of bread. These were little barley loaves. Barley, which is the food of the poor. The bread made from barley was made mostly by poor people. You weren't likely to find a loaf of barley bread at some king's table. So we had 5 loaves of bread, small loaves of bread, and a couple of fish. And these were probably not, don't think of the salmon that we get out down here, that can range, depending on the fishermen you're talking to, anywhere from here to here. We're not talking about that kind of fish. We're talking about little dried or pickled fish. Basically, this was a child's lunch. Maybe his mom had packed him this lunch. And that's this little lunch is what he offered up to the disciples to give to Jesus. But let's back up here to the beginning of this, where it starts with the compassion. And recognize that compassion breeds abundance. Notice Jesus' response to the crowd. He had compassion on them. He had sought solitude. He was grieving as only Jesus can for the loss of John. And Jesus knew, I'm sure we know Jesus knows where John is. He knows that, this is John the Baptist. This is, somebody who has served the Lord faithfully, and Jesus would know exactly where John is. Now, this is, of course, before, Jesus died on that cross. But he knows that John is in God's hands. And John is safe in that sense. But just because you know that somebody you love has gone on to be with the Lord, that doesn't mean you're not going to grieve or miss them. We as humans know that all too well. So Jesus is grieving over the loss of John. He wants to have some alone time with his disciples so they can, they can figure out what's going on and get their mind around it, for want of a better term. But when Jesus sees this crowd that has followed him around the lake, he has compassion, and that compassion results in power. His heart was moved by that compassion for those in need. God's heart is always attentive to our struggles, no matter how small those struggles may be. Often God's provision starts when we recognize His compassion in our daily lives, and when we invite Him into the places that feel barren or deserted, as the disciples described, where they were barren and empty. It's when we recognize that in our lives that we can see God at work and His power even greater than when we see it from day to day. Sometimes when we're the most exhausted is when we can be the most compassionate, like Jesus was. He was exhausted, but His compassion was still there. I think back to the pandemic. I had been a chaplain. I wasn't a chaplain there. I was up here when the pandemic struck, but I had several friends who were still working as chaplains, and they weren't really allowed into the hospital anymore. But they communicated with the staff and the nurses, and it's the nurses and the doctors that were dealing with that day-to-day, long, long days of pain. We're dealing with people sick and ill and dying. And as exhausted as they were, they still found time to comfort those patients, to hold their hands and to listen to their stories. Having known a number of the nursing staff back in Alamogordo, I can picture many of them staying extra hours just to step in and do the job of the chaplains. Since they wouldn't let the chaplains in there, my friends couldn't get in to see the patients, but we did a pretty good job when I was a chaplain down there of ministering to the staff and helping them be the chaplains when we couldn't be there. So I can picture some of them nurses still staying extra hours, as tired as they were. And I've heard the same stories from all over the country, from pastors and chaplains all over the country that were struggling with the same issue. They didn't like to let us in except for under the most extreme or dire circumstances of somebody dying, or when you needed to go in and deal with the family for them. But as I said, God's provision often starts when we're the most exhausted, and His compassion in our daily lives reveals itself greater at those times, especially when we invite Him into the places that feel barren and empty. The next thing we can see in this is, and I've got it labeled in my notes, is just consider the little. Consider the tiny amount of food that was offered up. This isn't a story about, so much a story about feeding a large crowd. It's a story about the limitless power of God. When the disciples saw the multitudes and saw or knew of their limited resources, they saw an impossible situation. John tells us that, I think it was Philip, when Jesus, when they came and told him that they needed to send these people away so they could get food, Philip didn't think they could possibly have enough money to purchase, even if they went to purchase the food. It would take more than they had available. And even Andrew, Simon's brother Andrew, when he told Jesus about this little boy's lunch, he didn't think it'd be enough. In John 6:9, we see that Andrew says, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" See, he had his doubts about being able to feed all those people. He certainly thought that such a tiny lunch was not going to would never be enough to feed that many people. It wouldn't have been enough to feed the disciples. In some ways, I can picture that little boy. It may have been a little boy, it may have been a teenager. The wording is very ambiguous in the original Greek and Aramaic. The word translated child could apply to a preschooler all the way through a young adult, 20-somethings. But I picture a little boy with a lunch his mother packed him, wanting to offer that, wanting to give that to Jesus or to the disciples. And I picture that way because, having raised a few children myself, they don't understand economics. To a child, $1 is a lot of money. When I was growing up, $1 was the largest allowance I ever got. It was $1 a month. That was my allowance growing up, and I thought I was rich when I get that dollar. Of course, back then a dollar bought a lot more. But I could picture this little boy with his tiny lunch thinking, I want to give this to Jesus. Because, little kids just don't know. And that's, I think, one reason why Jesus said that unless you accept God like a little child, you can't enter the kingdom of God. A child just believes. A child believes it's going to happen, and sometimes it does, especially in this case. But how often do we look at our own resources, our time, our talents, our finances, and feel that they're not enough? They're not enough to accomplish anything. They're not enough to even get done whatever needs to be done. And I'm not talking about tithing for the church here. I'm talking about everything that we have. How often do we feel it's not enough? I don't have enough talent to be a Sunday school teacher. I don't have enough talent to be an evangelist. I don't have enough talent to even tell my neighbor about Christ. I get tongue-tied. I don't know what to say. I'm not prepared for it. How often do we think our resources aren't enough? Jesus invites us to bring whatever we have, no matter how small, how unconsequential, no matter how little, bring what we have. And the miracles begin with that, not with abundance, but with a humble offering. Think about it this way: when you don't think you have enough talent, you just don't have enough to share Jesus with your next door neighbor or with a family member. You're not talented enough to do that, but think about it this way: you may be the last option that person will ever have to hear the gospel. In that case, your little talent is the biggest thing they could ever get. The few words you might be able to say about Jesus, maybe the last words they can hear before tragedy strikes, before there's no more opportunities. We read about it in the news every day. Tom's prayer request about his step niece. I guess that's what she'd be. Think about that. If that had turned the other direction, Tom may have been having us pray for the family because, she's gone. I'm thankful and praise God that wasn't the case, but we see it every day in the news. Young people, older people whose lives come to a sudden end. But think about that your little talent at sharing the gospel may be the last chance. And it applies to every resource we have, whether we're talking about the ability to share the gospel or the food we have, the finances we have. It may be, no matter how small, it may be the only option. I've seen a lot of great things happen when a bunch of people get together with only a little bit of money and apply it to a great big task. That's how economics works. But how often do we look at our resources and think they're not enough? Jesus invites us, again, he invites us to bring whatever we have, no matter how small. And that's when the miracles begin. Notice what Jesus does next. He takes those loaves and those fish. I always want to pluralize fish with fishes, but he takes those loaves and fish, as tiny as they were, and blesses them, and breaks them, and distributes them. But he blessed them, he consecrated them. And that led to expansion. You know, when we give our tiny talents, when we give our tiny offerings, we need to do so with a prayer, with a consecration. Ask God to bless it and multiply it. What Jesus did is a model for us. Take our tiny offerings, our minuscule offerings, and ask God to bless them and to multiply them. And he will. When we surrender our gift or gifts, however limited, to God, he sanctifies and multiplies for his glory. Our contribution in our families, churches, and community become holy work when we offer them to God. So often people contribute to charities for the tax write-off, and there's nothing wrong with taking a tax write-off. But we contribute to charities, but we don't ask God to bless that contribution. I think greater things could be done with it, with those small gifts, if we do that. Think about a gardener who plants a seed, a single seed. The seed seems insignificant. You know, most seeds are very tiny, but when placed in soil and cared for, intended, it grows into a plant, and sometimes those plants grow into bigger plants and fruit trees and tomato plants and all sorts of other things, and produce many, many fruit. In God's hand, our small offerings could be like that seed, multiplied beyond our expectations, like those loaves of bread and those couple fish in this story. One other thing we can see is we can celebrate our overflowing blessings under those circumstances. The story ends not with just enough. Think about that. At the end of this story, it wasn't just enough bread to feed everybody. They collected baskets full. 12 baskets were left over. 12 being, of course, also the number of disciples there. And I think that was to impress upon the disciples that there would be enough for all of them. Abundance. It wasn't just enough, it was an overabundance. And that's not teaching us that, well, when we give to the Lord, you know, we'll get great rewards back. That's not the point here. The point here is just to recognize that when we take our little offerings and give them to God, they can do great things, and there will be an abundance of leftovers. This abundance touches every area of our lives, spiritual, emotional, and physical. When we trust God with our scarcity, we can expect His multiplication. So let's give thanks, even in times of lack, believing that God can turn our little into more than enough. And I've seen that happen time and again. I've worked in ministries that were a result of that. I've talked about it last week, and several times, but that homeless ministry I was a part of in Alamogordo, that was started by one woman and her husband. She was, I know we're Baptists and don't think, a woman being ordained, but she'd just been ordained as a minister. And she wanted to plant a church, and they had scraped together the resources to buy an old church building over in the lesser, less popular part of Alamogordo, I'm going to put it that way. The wrong side of the tracks, if you will. And she was going to start a church there, plant a church there. And it wasn't long before she realized, though, that people were showing up hungry because there were a lot of homeless people in that area. So she pretty much converted that little church into a homeless ministry. She didn't have the resources to do that. But there were a number of people there in the community who offered little bits of money. By the time I became a part of that ministry, it had grown significantly. They went from having meals once or twice a week to having a meal every 2 meals a day for these homeless men and women that would come through there. And on top of that, it had grown into, we never did get to the point of an overnight shelter, but they did provide tents and sleeping bags and clothing. We always had more clothing than we needed. And there was always plenty of food because the contributions, the small contributions from individuals and Sunday school classes, there were no big donations. It was all small contributions added up to an abundance. So we were feeding people, these guys, 5 days a week, 2 meals a day. They could shower every day. They could wash their clothes every day. We provided them with food for the weekends that they took with them, canned goods. And we never ran out. I don't recall one time when there wasn't enough available. When Chris passed away a few years ago, just before we came up here, I thought, well, that's it. That ministry probably closed down, but no, it didn't. It has, in the last few years, been taken over by another much larger ministry. So it's an even bigger ministry now than it was then. God took the tiny offering of one person and grew it into a significant feeding ministry there in Alamogordo. And I don't remember the numbers of guys that came through there every week. It was hard to keep count. But let's suffice, nobody in Alamogordo had to go hungry. You didn't have to be specifically homeless to come by and get a meal. It might have been in our rules that you had to be homeless, but I don't think we ever turned anybody away. But God can take tiny amounts and multiply it into great things. And food, of course, is one of those things that we see in the Bible quite often. Divine food provisions, in both the Old and New Testament. God's ability to provide food at times when it is scarce has been is a reoccurring theme in the Bible. I think about a couple of the big ones or the key ones. In the Old Testament, the most obvious one is the manna in Exodus and Numbers. The manna that's provided every day for the Israelites there in the wilderness. And there were some meat offerings there too, birds and different things to provide food for all the thousands and thousands of Israelites that were wandering in the desert at that time. God recognizes that as humans we have a need, and food is one of those greatest needs, and he provides for it. Another time was in 2 Kings. This may be the one that was alluded to by Jesus in the story. But in 2 Kings, the story of when the prophet Elisha feeds 100 men with 20 loaves. In 2 Kings 4:42, a man from Baal Shalishah came to the man of God, that would be Elijah, with his sack full of 20 loaves of barley bread. There's that barley bread again, by the way. From the first bread of the harvest. Elijah said, "Give it to the people to eat," but Elijah's attendant, it's like Jesus' disciples, his attendant asked, "What, am I to set this before 100 men? It's not going to be enough, Elijah. You got 100 people here." But he said, "Give it to the people to eat. For this is what the Lord says, they will eat and they will have some left over." So he set it before them, and as the Lord had promised, they ate and had some left over. Notice the similarities between that one and the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 there. The parallel here is important because Elijah fed 100 men with more bread. Jesus fed 5,000. It points to the fact that Jesus is greater than Elijah. But we need to call it what it is, that Jesus' ability to multiply the loaves of fish is a clear demonstration of his divine power. That's why all four of the gospel writers included this story in their gospels. Jesus did this not just to create more food out of nothing. He didn't just create more food out of nothing. He multiplied what was already there. I'm sure Jesus could have done what Satan challenged him to do, to turn the rocks into bread, but Jesus took a small offering and multiplied it in order to reveal to us, or to show us, that God can use our small offerings and multiply them. And again, I'm talking not just about money, I'm talking about our talents and our time. How many of you have, at some point in your life, thought, I just don't have enough time to get that done? I don't have time to go to church. I regret that I have said that a few times back when I was working and not pastoring. So even our time can be multiplied if we give our time over to Jesus. He can multiply everything. And he can do it in order to meet the needs of many. So this is a reminder that anything is possible with God. So we've seen what it meant here in this story, but what's it mean for us today? And it means that we are called to recognize our own limitations, of course, but recognize them not as barriers, but as opportunities for God to work. Think of those limitations that you perceive that you may have, and think of them as opportunities for God to do great things. We are invited to offer what we have, however small, offer that to Jesus, and we are challenged to step out in faith and action and participate in God's work in the world. Let's not hold back because we feel inadequate or we feel that what we have is inadequate. Instead, trust God. Trust that he can transform our scarcity into abundance. That's my invitation for us today. Just trust God to take what little bit we have and multiply it. If we could do that here in this community, and again, I'm not talking just about money, if we could do that just with our time and our talents, we could see great growth for the church here in this community. Take our little loaves and fish, and trust God to multiply them, to multiply all of our resources, and watch God. Watch Him multiply them for His glory and for the good of others. Let's go, Lord, in prayer.